Chapter 12. The Cap Box. Frank reached into the hole and pulled out the bandolier. Its leather strap was rotted with age and worn away from the rusted buckle, but the silver cap box was still firmly attached by 2 rivets. While Joe and Chet looked on excitedly, Frank tried to open the box. "There doesn't seem to be any way to unfasten the lid," he said. "Must be a secret lock on it." "Let me try it," Joe said eagerly, reaching for the bandolier. "Careful," Frank warned. "Don't break the leather. General Smith will certainly want to keep this." Joe handed the bandolier over gingerly, and then turning the box over and over in vain, in an attempt to locate the hasp or tiny hinges. "I can't find any opening either," he said finally. "We'll have to put it under a magnifying glass." "Let me see it," Chet begged, extending an eager hand. As Joe gave the bandolier to his friend, they heard a woman scream. The cry for help that followed came from the woods just ahead. "Someone's in trouble," Frank cried. The 3 boys raced in the direction from which the sound had come. The Hardys soon outdistanced Chet, who panted some distance behind them. Joe and Frank searched futilely for the woman who had screamed. "Hello? Hello?" Joe shouted, but got no reply. "That's funny," Frank said. The voice sounded as if, "Hey, did you hear Chet cry out?" The Hardys turned and rushed back. 100 feet beyond, Chet was struggling from the ground, rubbing his head. His hands were empty. "Get him!" he cried hoarsely. "Someone hit me from behind and grabbed the bandolier." The Hardys waited no further for any more explanation than Chet's pointing finger. The cry had clearly been a hoax to separate the trio, while someone stole the secret to the missing gold. Probably the thief had called in a falsetto voice, then had circled back through the brush to waylay Chet. The boys could hear 2 persons crashing through the woodland and raced after them at top speed. "They're heading for the highway," Frank exclaimed. The brothers saw 2 figures scramble up the embankment to the new bridge. A moment later they heard the roar of a motor. "Oh no!" Joe cried in dismay. The familiar black sedan, which had apparently been parked at the bridge waiting, sped off in the direction of Centerville. "We'll catch them!" Frank dashed toward their own car, and then let out a cry of despair. The left front tire of the vehicle was flat. Bush's men must have let the air out. "What goofs we were not to leave Chet here on guard while you and I search for the bandolier," Joe said bitterly. At that moment Chet lumbered up the bank and onto the bridge. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Why didn't you chase those guys?" Joe told him as he opened the trunk and pulled out a spare tire. "Hey, a car's coming," Frank said, running onto the bridge. He raised his hand and a speedy little sports car squealed to a stop. "Give me a lift? We've got a flat." "Hop in," said a middle-aged man. Frank turned to his brother and Chet. "Meet me in Centerville. I'm going to find out where that car went." Frank stepped into the car, and the driver continued in the direction which the black sedan had taken only a few minutes before. Without revealing the details, Frank told the driver that the boys had been robbed. Upon hearing this, the man speeded up. When they came to the brow of a small hill, Frank saw the sedan crossing a bridge about a mile away. "There they go!" The excitement of the chase stimulated the sports car driver, and he went even faster. But they could not overtake the sedan. At a crossroad, Frank's keen eyes spotted the telltale marks of a swerving car. "They turned in here," he said. The man braked back up and looked at the skid marks and then agreed with Frank. "But," he added, "I must keep on this road to Hilton. I wish I could follow that car, but I have an urgent appointment." "Then let me out here," Frank said. "Many thanks for the lift." The man sped off, and Frank examined the marks of the thieves' tires on the dirt road. After noting the design of the treads for further identification, he set off along the road at a trot. Half a mile further on, he paused again at a crossroad, picking out the tread along the right-handed fork, and hurried along. After following the tire tracks for about a mile, Frank stopped short. The line suddenly left the road and slewed off into a thicket. Entering the woods, he proceeded with caution to avoid any possible danger of ambush. The tracks led into a thick copse, interspersed with shrubby trees. Except for a few birds and a scampering squirrel, there was not a sound. Ahead, under a low-hanging tree, Frank found the parked sedan. It was deserted. He scraped away the mud on the license plate and jotted down the number, then studied the footprints near the sedan. They were hard to follow, for the thieves seemed to have separated at this point. Frank chose to follow the deepest prints, which presently led back to the side of the road. From here they ran straight, skirting the old battlefield of Rocky Run, and then strangely they were gone completely. As Frank stood debating what to do next, he realized that the museum was located directly to the right. Had the thieves gone there to investigate? I'll see what's going on anyway, Frank thought. That professor and the guard are sure phonies. As he walked along, he mulled over the events of the past few hours. Frank was convinced there might be a tie-in between the man who'd grabbed the bandolier and the professor. This time he would spy on the place and perhaps learn something important. Frank jumped a ditch beside the road and hid behind a tree. After glancing around cautiously and seeing nobody, he pressed his way along the field fence toward the old building. No one was in sight. The windows were closed and locked, as was the cellar door. Deciding to risk a look inside the old headquarters, Frank went around quietly to the front door. It stood open, and the guard was not there. He listened. Not a sound, so he slipped inside. From somewhere in the building came an indistinct but angry voice. "You fool! The secret? You bungle everything, Smiley!" The voice was that of Junior, alias Jimmy of the chute. "I tell you, it ain't safe to carry it," Smiley cried out. "Nobody'd think of looking for it among the souvenirs," he declared. Excitedly, Frank darted around the room. He glanced at all the tables and looked under the large exhibits for the stolen bandolier. Suddenly, his eyes spotted something unusual in the display case, where he'd picked up the old canteen. A Confederate cap was tilted at a peculiar angle. Frank lifted it. Underneath lay the silver cap box. Frank let out a low whistle as he grasped the box and then tiptoed toward the door. Just as he reached the end of the room, a section of the floor in front of him raised up, and Smiley popped out of a trap door. Frank sidestepped him neatly, but the man spotted the cap box in the boy's hand. "You're not getting away with that," Smiley snarled and lunged toward him. Smiley was almost upon Frank, but with head down and arms in front of him, the boy hit the man with the force of a fullback plowing through the line. Smiley grunted, reeled, and fell. Frank bolted through the door, ready for his next opponent, but no one was in sight. His long legs fairly flew down the road. He looked back and saw someone following, but he maintained his pace. The pursuer was finally lost from sight. Frank did not slacken his speed until he was half a mile away, and then he settled down to an easy lope, presently clutching the cap box. He came into sight of the highway leading into Centerville. He'd not gone far when he heard the sound of a car. Apprehension gripped him. Had the thieves caught up with him? Frank hid behind the hedge and waited, his heart pounding like a riveting machine. As the car approached, he gave a whoop of joy. It was the Hardy's convertible. "Hi there," he called out, stepping into the road. Joe drammed on the brakes, and Frank jumped in. "I've got it," he panted, showing his prize. "Get to the general as fast as you can." "Great work," Joe cried, and sent the car speeding down the road. As they drove, Frank told his brother and Chet how he'd trailed the thieves and seized the precious relic. "There's no doubt now that Junior and Smiley, that's the guard's name, are mixed up in this thing. Probably the professor is in it with them, too," he said. "And we know that Dr. Bush is an enemy." The boys reached the house and ran in with the bandolier's ammunition box. The general was both elated and astonished at their find. When the officer heard the story, he lost no time informing the chief of police of the strange doings at the old museum, and reported the license number of the black sedan. I think these men might belong to a gang headed by a Dr. Bush, the General Smith reported. Chet felt relieved and hoped the troublemakers would soon be arrested, or leave when they saw that the police were checking on them. But Frank and Joe were of a different opinion. This missing gold is a big prize, Frank pointed out, and if that's what they're after, they won't be frightened into running away. They'll probably go into hiding at some new place around Centerville, Joe reasoned. I wasn't much of a detective, General Smith remarked about his own investigation of Professor Randolph. The museum seemed to be running the same as ever when I visited it. The old man was there and everything was peaceful. I didn't pick up a single clue. Joe smiled ruefully. Smiley wasn't on guard because he and Junior were probably the two who chased after and attacked Chet and then took the bandolier. Frank went to the kitchen and asked Claude for some silver polish and a cloth. The others followed and watched as he went to work on the ammunition box. In a few minutes, the old souvenir, blackened by its long concealment in the bridge abutment, shone brightly. "Why'd you do that?" Chet asked. "So we can examine it better," Frank said. "Joe, will you get our magnifying glass?" His brother went to the trunk of the car and returned with a special kit that the Hardys always carried. From it, he took a powerful magnifier. Frank held the ammunition box under a bright light and went over it in minute detail. "I think I see where you open this," he stated at last. "Where?" Chet questioned, looking over his shoulder. "Right here in the corner." Frank pointed to a tiny circle cleverly worked into one edge of the box. "Now, if the spring hasn't rusted, this ought to do it." He snapped out the can opener blade on his knife and carefully pressed the point against the circle. With a sharp click that startled the onlookers, the top of the box sprang open. "Bravo!" the general shouted. Joe emitted a low whistle. No wonder those crooks couldn't open it. Frank pried a piece of the folded parchment from the bottom of the box. The paper was in perfect condition, despite the many years it had lain secreted. Frank handed it to General Smith. "Just think," Joe said. "The last man to see this was your great-grandfather." The general did not reply. The boys were silent as they observed the solemn expression on the handsome, tanned face. And then he spoke. "This is strange. Very strange indeed. I suddenly had the feeling that I was standing in my great-grandfather's place. And there, in my old headquarters, when he put this paper into the ammunition box and made ready for battle." Chet cleared his throat and fidgeted. He wanted to know what was on that paper. "This is a great moment for me," the man went on. "I wonder what the message says." The boys turned their eyes from the officer to the table on which he spread the paper. "Look at that!" Joe exclaimed. "It's in code!" End of chapter 12.